In the unforgiving winter of 1992, Bill "Seven" Carter, Maine's most formidable hunter, faced a creature of nightmare. Golden eyes, dagger teeth, raw muscle under black fur. He put it down, or so he thought. 3 days later, the monster's colossal body had vanished, leaving only a crimson stain on the pristine snow. Now something stalks Bill from the shadows, something ancient and malevolent, something that doesn't just die. It vanishes, and then it watches. Are you ready to hear what happened when the hunter became the hunted, and the woods themselves started to breathe? The Maine winter of 1992 had settled in deep, a thick glacial silence blanketing everything in its path. For Bill "Seven" Carter, this wasn't just a season, it was a way of life. His small, weathered cabin, nestled deep within the whispering pines of Aroostook County, was more than a home. It was a fortress against the raw, unforgiving wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Bill was a man carved from the same hard granite as the land he inhabited, weathered by countless seasons, his eyes holding the keen, observant gaze of a predator who understood the delicate balance of life and death in the frozen woods. His reputation preceded him, not just for his unerring aim or his encyclopedic knowledge of the forest, but for his loyal pack of 7 hounds. 7 was both his nickname and a testament to the inseparable bond he shared with these magnificent animals. They weren't just dogs. They were an extension of his will, a symphony of muscle, instinct, and unparalleled tracking ability. Large, powerful breeds, a mix of black and tan coonhounds, a couple of red bones, and a formidable Great Dane cross. They were trained for anything the wild could throw at them. Bears, bobcats, rogue coyotes, they'd faced them all, always emerging victorious, always bringing their quarry to bay. On this particular night, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The cold bit clean, sharp, like a surgeon's scalpel, leaving the scent of pine and crisp ice hanging heavy. Above, the full moon, a luminous disk of bleached bone, hung low in the velvet sky, casting an ethereal glow over the pristine snow. Every flake glittered, turning the familiar landscape into a shimmering, alien world. The silence was profound, unnerving. No crickets chirped, no distant hoot of an owl broke the stillness. Even the wind, usually a constant companion, had fallen mute. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on a man, making his own heartbeat sound like a distant drum, making the blood hum in his ears. Bill sat by the hearth, the warmth of the roaring fire doing little to thaw the curious unease that had settled in his bones. His hounds lay scattered around the cabin, a tapestry of sleeping fur and twitching ears, but even they seemed to sense the strangeness of the night. A low, almost imperceptible whine escaped from Buster, his oldest and most astute hound. His eyes cracked open, staring intently towards the darkened window. Bill had been restless all day, an old hunter's instinct prickling at the back of his neck. He'd seen them earlier, near the edge of his property line. Deer tracks, big ones. Too big, almost, and too deep, as if the animal was carrying an impossible weight. He'd dismissed it then, attributing it to a prime buck, heavy with winter. Fat, but the image lingered. Now, with the moon high and that chilling silence outside, the tracks pulled at him, a silent summons he couldn't ignore. He rose, the old floorboards groaning under his weight, and walked to the window. The snow gleamed, an endless canvas of white, stretching towards the impenetrable wall of pines. There was something ancient stirring out there, a primal energy that seeped through the very pores of the land. He glanced at his rifle leaning against the wall, its cold steel a familiar comfort. He wouldn't be hunting in the traditional sense, not tonight. Just checking, investigating. Something about the night felt different, like the veil between worlds had thinned, and a peculiar, almost unnerving pull beckoned him deeper into its cold, dark embrace. A strange, inexplicable urge to witness whatever lay hidden beneath the pristine blanket of snow. Bill moved with the quiet grace of a man who had spent his life navigating the unforgiving terrain of the wilderness. His 7 hounds, usually a boisterous symphony of sniffing and rustling, were unusually subdued, their movements muted by the deep snow. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of Bill's worn boots and the soft padding of the dog's paws. Each breath billowed out in white clouds, instantly dissolving into the frigid air. The forest itself was a masterpiece of stark, brutal beauty. Ancient pines, heavy with snow, stood like silent sentinels, their branches creating a vast, intricate lace against the moonlit sky. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns of silver and shadow. It was breathtaking, but chillingly so. There were no rustles of small animals, no distant calls of winter birds, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. It was a vacuum of sound, a profound stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Bill's eyes, narrowed and keen, scanned the landscape. His gaze fell upon the deer tracks, still visible beneath a fresh dusting of snow. They were deep, deeper than any deer he'd ever tracked, almost like a heavy man had stumbled through the drifts. He followed them, his instincts telling him to be wary. His dogs, usually eager to follow a scent, now moved closer to him, their bodies brushing against his legs, their soft whines and anxious murmur. Their ears, normally swiveling independently, were now pricked high, twitching in unison, fixed on something unseen ahead. As they ventured deeper, the shadows grew longer, more twisted, playing tricks on Bill's eyes. A gnarled branch became a crouching figure, a snow-covered boulder seemed to shift. He shook his head, blaming it on the moonlight and the eerie quiet. Yet the unsettling feeling persisted, a cold knot in his stomach. The air itself seemed to thicken, growing colder, heavier, carrying with it a faint, musky scent that was not deer, not bear, not even wolf. It was something else, something alien. The deer tracks eventually led them to a small clearing, shrouded in deeper shadows. The air here was even colder, almost painful to breathe. Bill stopped, raising a hand to halt his hounds. They froze, their bodies tensed, their gazes fixed on the impenetrable darkness at the far end of the clearing. Buster, who usually led the charge, now pressed himself against Bill's leg, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. It wasn't a challenge. It was a deep, primal warning. Bill gripped his rifle tighter, the cold metal a stark contrast to the sudden clamminess of his palms. He strained his ears, listening. Nothing, just the frantic beat of his own heart. He took a cautious step forward, his boot crunching softly on the snow. Then it came. A sudden guttural growl ripped through the profound stillness, not from his hounds, but from somewhere ahead, beyond the clearing, between the ancient snow-laden pines. It was a sound that vibrated through the frozen ground and settled deep in Bill's chest. A sound that transcended animalistic fury, laced with something ancient and truly menacing. His dogs, usually unwavering in the face of danger, recoiled, shrinking back, their hackles rising in unison, eyes wide with a primal fear that mirrored Bill's own. The silence had been terrifying. This sound was far, far worse. The growl lingered. In the air, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to make the very pines shiver. Bill's breath hitched. His fingers tightened on the cold steel of his shotgun, the safety clicking off with a soft, almost imperceptible snick. His hounds, a formidable force, were now a trembling mass behind him, their low whimpers a stark testament to the unnatural terror they sensed. Then, it emerged, from the deepest shadows at the edge of the clearing, where the moonlight struggled to penetrate. A silhouette materialized. It was immense, far too large to be a bear, too upright to be a wolf. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, stepping into a sliver of moonlight, and Bill's blood ran cold. It was tall, far taller than any man, standing on 2 powerful legs. Muscles rippled beneath matted dark fur that seemed to absorb the light, making it a living shadow. Its head was low, snout long but wrong, too human-like in its overall structure, yet unmistakably bestial. And its eyes. They were a vivid, terrifying gold, glowing with an unholy intensity, fixed on Bill with a chilling, predatory intelligence. Its teeth, when its lips peeled back in a silent snarl, were long ivory daggers, impossibly sharp, glistening with something wet and dark. The creature didn't hesitate. With a primal roar that tore through the quiet night, a sound that was less animal and more a tortured scream, it launched itself. It was a blur of black fur and raw power, covering the distance in a single impossible bound. Bill barely had time to react before the monstrous weight slammed into him, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him sprawling backward into the deep snow, his head hitting the frozen ground with a sickening thud. The rifle spun from his grasp, sliding out of reach. Before the creature could follow up, before those razor claws could find his flesh, his hounds reacted. Like a perfectly coordinated storm, they erupted. Old Buster, with an uncharacteristic snarl of pure rage, was the first, leaping onto the monster's back, his powerful jaws finding purchase in the creature's thick fur. Daisy and Ranger, the two Redbones, attacked the legs, their teeth tearing at the creature's thick tendons. The others, Shadow, Bear, Luna, and King, joined the fray, a whirlwind of snapping jaws and furious barks, clawing at the beast's flanks, its neck, its chest. The clearing became a maelstrom of primal violence. The creature thrashed, a guttural roar escaping its throat, its massive limbs flailing, sending hounds tumbling into the snow. One of the black and tans, Shadow, cried out, a short, sharp yelp of pain as he was flung against a tree. But the dogs held on, their collective fury buying Bill precious seconds. Dazed, disoriented, the cold seeping into his bruised back, Bill scrabbled blindly in the snow. His fingers brushed against something cold and hard. His rifle. He seized it, his grip trembling. The familiar weight a sudden surge of desperate hope. The monster was still engaged with his valiant hounds, tearing at their bodies, its golden eyes alight with savage fury. Was momentarily distracted, its attention on the snarling, biting mass of canine muscle. Bill brought the shotgun up, his hands shaking, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He aimed, not for the head, a moving target, obscured by his dogs, but for the broad, matted chest, the center mass of the hulking beast. He took a breath, held it. With a dry, deafening boom, the shotgun blast ripped through the frigid night, momentarily silencing the frenzied snarls and roars. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure agony mixed with something undeniably human, a guttural, dying wail that seemed to tear at the fabric of the cold air itself. It stumbled, its massive body reeling, the hounds falling away as it lost its footing. It crashed heavily into the snow, its enormous form leaving a grotesque crimson stain that instantly began to spread, stark against the pristine white. Bill watched, transfixed, as the monster gave one final shuddering gasp, then lay motionless. But even as it lay still, the golden eyes, though dimming, seemed to hold a chilling flicker of malevolent intelligence, fixed on Bill, a silent, unsettling promise that transcended death. The silence that followed the shot was deafening, a thick, smothering blanket after the maelstrom of violence. Bill lay sprawled in the snow, chest heaving, the acrid tang of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. He pushed himself up slowly, every muscle protesting, his mind struggling to reconcile what had just happened with everything he thought he knew. The creature lay before him, an obscene blot on the pristine snow. It was even more terrifying in stillness. Its immense body, rapidly cooling in the biting air, seemed to defy logic. The fur, once a living shadow, was now matted with blood and snow, revealing glimpses of raw, coiled muscle underneath. The limbs were disturbingly humanoid in their structure, but oversized, grotesque, ending in taloned hands and feet. Its snout, too, was wrong, a bestial muzzle that seemed to twist into something resembling a distorted human face in the moonlight. Its long, dagger-like teeth still bared in a silent, eternal snarl. Was it a man, a beast, an aberration? Bill's mind reeled, unable to categorize the horror. He felt a soft nuzzle against his hand. His hounds. They limped towards him, whimpering, their fur bristling, eyes wide and still filled with primal fear. Buster, his old friend, nudged his hand again, then let out a low, mournful howl, a sound of profound grief and trauma. Bill knelt, running his hands over their trembling bodies, checking for injuries. Several had deep gashes, their own blood mingling with the monsters on the snow, but they were alive. All 7. A miracle. He looked back at the corpse. What was he supposed to do with it? Dragging it through the snow was impossible. The thing weighed a ton, easily twice his own weight, perhaps more. Burning it was out of the question. The snow was too deep, the wood too wet. And burying it? The ground was frozen solid, harder than concrete. The thought of bringing it back to his cabin, of having that thing anywhere near his home, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. His only instinct was to escape, to put as much distance between himself and this nightmare as possible. He made the difficult decision to leave it. The cold would preserve it, he reasoned, until daylight, until he could think more clearly, maybe come back with help. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't be telling anyone. Who would believe him? They'd call him mad. He turned, gathering his injured hounds, urging them back towards the faint glow of his cabin lights through the trees. The walk back was a haunted procession. Every snap of a twig, every shift of shadow made him jump. The woods, once a source of comfort and familiarity, now felt predatory, its silence no longer peaceful, but heavy with unseen watchers. The image of the creature's dying gaze, the chilling flicker in those golden eyes, was seared into his memory, a silent, unsettling promise that transcended death. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just killed a monster. He had disturbed something ancient, something that defied the natural order of his world. Back in the dubious sanctuary of his cabin, the roaring fire in the hearth offered little warmth against the chill that had settled deep in Bill's bones. He cleaned his shotgun, the acrid scent of gunpowder mingling with the phantom smell of blood and something else. Something wild, ancient, and undeniably wrong. He fed his dogs, bandaged their wounds, their mournful whines a constant echo of the night's terror. Sleep refused to come. He sat by the window, staring out at the moonlight, replaying the scene over and over, trying to find a rational explanation, and failing. As he finally succumbed to a fitful, dream-laden sleep hours later, the last image in his mind was not the creature's dying scream, but the chillingly intelligent glint in those golden eyes, a silent testament that this was far from. For the 3 days following the encounter bled into each other, a blur of restless nights and anxious, strained days. Sleep, when it came, was a battlefield of fragmented nightmares. Golden eyes glowing in the dark, the sickening crunch of bone, the creature's scream, a sound that was less animal and more a tortured human wail. Bill woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the cabin's familiar silence now feeling like a trap. He tried to rationalize it, to make sense of the impossible. He paced his small cabin, running through every detail of the encounter, every sound, every instinct. Was it a wolf? No, too big, too human. A bear. Bears didn't walk on 2 legs like that, didn't have those eyes, those teeth. A man in some kind of costume. The sheer muscle, the speed, the raw power. It defied explanation. He even considered a hallucination, a stress-induced break. But the sight of his injured dogs, their raw wounds and lingering fear, anchored him firmly to the horrifying reality. His hounds were quiet, too quiet. Their usual boisterous energy had been replaced by a pervasive lethargy. They moved stiffly, nursing their wounds, but more profoundly they seemed subdued, their eyes often fixed on the windows, their ears twitching at sounds Bill couldn't hear. They were constantly close to him, pressing against his legs, seeking comfort, but also, he realized, seeking protection. Their anxious whines, their refusal to venture outside without his direct command, mirrored his own escalating unease. The cabin, once a haven of warmth and security, now felt like a fragile shell, a thin shield against something unimaginable lurking just beyond the threshold of his perception. The weight of the unspeakable secret pressed down on him. He considered calling someone, Sheriff Brody perhaps, or even a wildlife expert from Bangor. But what would he say? I shot a monster, something with golden eyes and human teeth, and it weighed 1,000 pounds. They'd have him committed. So he kept it to himself, the isolation magnifying the terror. He wrestled with the gnawing curiosity to return to the site. A desperate need for answers warred with an instinctual, paralyzing fear of what he might find. Or, more terrifyingly, what he might not find. The image of the creature's immense body, stained red against the snow, was burned into his mind. He needed to know if it was still there, if it was real, if it had just been a particularly aggressive, deformed beast. But the memory of those dying golden eyes holding a chilling intelligence stopped him cold every time he reached for his coat. On the third day, the moon, though waning, still cast its ghostly, unsettling light over the silent landscape. An unnatural quiet, deeper and more profound than the usual winter hush, seemed to settle over the woods, pressing in on the cabin. Bill couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lingering on his home from the dark tree line. It was a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a phantom whisper on the periphery of his hearing. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that he had to go back. The unknown was worse than any horror. He had to know. As he finally gripped his rifle, the cold steel a familiar weight in his shaking hands, the distinct, almost human-like prints of his own boots from 3 nights prior seemed to pull him towards the red stain, an invitation he could no longer refuse, a morbid curiosity overriding all fear. The return journey was a nightmare of heightened senses and creeping dread. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every distant creak of frozen branches sounded like approaching footsteps. Bill moved slowly, his rifle held ready, his gaze sweeping the tree line, half expecting the nightmare to reappear, to burst from the snow-laden pines. His hounds, though still limping, were remarkably alert, their muzzles constantly sniffing the air, their low growls a constant accompaniment to his own racing heartbeat. When he reached the clearing, the sight was drastically different from what he had braced himself for. The massive bloodstain remained, a vivid, obscene crimson against the white snow, frozen solid now. It was a stark, undeniable testament to the horror that had unfolded. But the body was gone. Not just gone, but the snow around the stain was heavily disturbed, churned up in a chaotic tapestry of countless wild animal tracks. Coyotes, certainly. Wolves, a whole pack, perhaps. He even saw the telltale imprint of a large bear paw. They converged on the blood-soaked spot, forming a gruesome vortex, then fanned out, disappearing back into the forest. Bill crouched, running a gloved hand over the disturbed snow. His brow furrowed in confusion. There were no drag marks, no sign that the enormous body had been hauled away. And stranger still, despite the evidence of a frantic feeding frenzy, there were no bones. No scraps of fur, no dismembered limbs, nothing left behind that a pack of scavengers would typically leave. The ground was just churned, as if something had burst forth from below or melted back into the earth. The air itself felt different here. It was heavy, thick with a primal, unsettling odor that was cloying and acrid. It smelled faintly metallic, like old blood. But beneath that, something else, a musky, sulfuric scent, like something ancient and truly terrible had been unearthed, then disappeared without a trace. It made his stomach clench. He circled, the bloodstain, his eyes scanning for any clue, any sign that could explain the impossible. The chaos of tracks, the utter lack of remains. It defied logic, defied every law of nature he had ever known. A pack of animals, even a large one, would have left something, but there was nothing, only silence. A silence even deeper than before, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, shocked by what had transpired on its snow-covered floor. His hounds whined, nudging his leg, their eyes wide and fixed on the empty spot where the monster had fallen. They sensed it too, the profound wrongness of the scene. Bill looked at the vast, silent woods, the dense pines seeming to lean in, pressing down on him. The sheer impossibility of it all sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him, colder than the winter air. What could consume such a massive creature so utterly, leaving not a trace? And then, far off, barely a whisper on the wind, he heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible howl, a phantom echo of the one that had chilled him to the bone just nights before. It was distant, ethereal, barely there, and yet it resonated deep in his chest, a low, mournful sound that seemed to call from the very heart of the wilderness. Or was it just the wind, playing tricks on a mind pushed to its limits, twisting the mournful sigh of the trees into the ghostly cry of a beast he had seemingly vanquished? Bill stood frozen, straining to hear it again. But the sound vanished, as quickly as it came, swallowed by the profound and terrifying silence of the Maine winter. He was alone, with nothing but questions and a growing, horrifying certainty that he had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. The vanishing act of the creature's body plunged Bill deeper into a terrifying abyss of confusion and paranoia. The sheer impossibility of it gnawed at him, picking away at the edges of his sanity. He spent restless nights poring over old books, dusty tomes on local folklore and forgotten legends. He searched for anything that might explain what he saw, what he killed, and what happened to its impossible remains. Werewolves, wendigos, skinwalkers. He'd scoffed at such tales his entire life, dismissing them as the superstitious ramblings of isolated minds. Now he found himself devouring every unsettling detail, every chilling possibility. His hunting routine, once a source of calm and rhythm, became an obsessive exercise in caution. He avoided the deeper woods, sticking to the familiar paths near his property. But even there, he felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. He'd stop mid-stride, rifle raised, scanning the tree line, convinced he'd seen a flicker of movement, a darker shadow against the already dark pines. But there was never anything there, or was there? His dogs were a constant reminder of the unseen presence. They were more alert than ever, often staring intently into the dark woods at night, their ears pricked, a low, throaty growl rumbling in their chests. Sometimes they'd let out a sharp, agitated bark at seemingly nothing, their hackles rising as if facing an invisible foe. Bill would follow their gaze, straining his eyes, but saw only the familiar, silent forest. He'd dismiss it as heightened sensitivity from their recent trauma, yet a deeper, primal part of him knew better. They saw something he couldn't, or sensed something he was only beginning to perceive. He found himself attributing the unsettling phenomena to stress, the trauma of the encounter twisting his perceptions, the constant cold, the isolation, the lack of sleep. Surely that was it. But then he'd hear it, the faint, unmistakable snap of a twig when there was no wind, the soft brush of something, large moving through undergrowth, just beyond his peripheral vision. He'd spin around, shotgun ready, only to face an empty, silent landscape, the moonlight illuminating nothing but snow and trees. It was a game, he realized, a horrifying game of cat and mouse where he was unknowingly the mouse. He subtly questioned locals during his infrequent trips to town for supplies. Old Man Hemlock, who'd lived in these woods for 80 years, spoke in hushed tones of things best left alone and spirits of the ancient woods. Young Sheriff Brody, a practical man of science, offered theories of rogue bears and exaggerated tales. Bill nodded, played along, but the seeds of dread had already taken root. One moonlit night, as Bill sat by his window, rifle resting across his lap, watching the familiar tree line outside his cabin, he blinked. For a fleeting second he was convinced he saw something tall and dark stand motionless at the very edge where the moonlight barely touched. It was immense, a towering silhouette that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It stood for only a heartbeat, unmoving, watching, before melting back into the impenetrable shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. He strained his eyes, pressing his face against the cold glass, but it was gone. Then, from the woods, a single sharp crack of a branch splintering under immense weight echoed through the profound silence, far too loud to be natural. It was followed by an absolute suffocating silence, the kind of silence that screams. He knew, with a horrifying certainty, that this was no trick of the light, no overstressed mind. It was real, and it was watching. The incident at the window shattered any lingering illusions Bill harbored about his sanity. He wasn't just disturbed, he was becoming consumed by paranoia. The fleeting glimpse of the towering silhouette, followed by the unnatural snap of the branch, left him with a cold, hollow pit in his stomach. The woods, once his sanctuary, had become a vast, hostile eye, constantly watching him. He began fortifying his cabin. He boarded up windows with thick planks of salvaged timber, reinforced his doors with heavy steel bars, and even strung tripwires with empty cans and bells around the perimeter of his property. It was a desperate, almost pathetic attempt. He knew. What could a few planks and noisy cans do against something that moved with such unnatural stealth and possessed such monstrous strength? But he had to do something. The inaction was worse than the futile effort. The silhouettes became more frequent, more distinct. He saw them, not just at night, but in the fleeting moments of twilight and dawn. Always on the periphery of his vision, always just out of direct sight, always at the very edge of where the moonlight or sun's first rays barely touched. They were like living shadows, vast and indistinct, sometimes alone, sometimes a cluster of them, a silent, unnerving audience to his isolated existence. He'd spin around, shotgun in hand, but they'd vanish before he could get a clear look, leaving behind only the profound, unsettling quiet of the winter woods. He tried to track them. He spent hours, rifle ready, combing the snow around his property line, seeking prints. He found some faint indentations too large for any known animal, too shallow for something so heavy, or sometimes too many, a chaotic jumble of prints that defied logic. They weren't clear enough to identify, always blurring into the natural patterns of the snow or disappearing abruptly, as if the creature had simply lifted into the air. It was as if they mocked him, leaving just enough evidence to confirm their presence but never enough to reveal their true nature or numbers. A terrifying realization began to dawn on him. It wasn't just one thing. The chaotic tracks, the multiple fleeting glimpses. This wasn't a lone beast he had angered. This was something larger, something ancient, perhaps even a whole community of these things. And they were aware of him. They knew where he lived. They knew he had crossed them. And now, they were toying with him, making their presence known in the most insidious ways, wearing down his resolve, eroding his sanity. The silence of the forest was no longer just quiet. It was pregnant with unseen gazes, a living, breathing malevolence that permeated the very air. As he stood on his porch late one bitter night, the cold biting at his exposed skin, Bill clutched his rifle, his knuckles white. He surveyed the moonlit expanse of snow, his breath pluming in frosty clouds. He'd done this every night since the incident, a desperate, hopeless vigil. He scanned the familiar line of pines, straining his eyes. And then he saw, not a fleeting silhouette this time, but a momentary gleam, undeniable and chilling. Two golden eyes reflecting the distant moon held his gaze for a fraction of a second from just beyond the reach of his porch light. They were unblinking, predatory, filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence that made the hair on his arms stand on end. They held for a fraction of a second, an eternity of silent accusation and simmering threat, before vanishing as quickly as they appeared, melting back into the impenetrable darkness. But the image was seared into his mind, burned behind his eyelids, and this time he knew with a terrifying certainty. It wasn't just watching him, it was waiting, and soon its patience would run out. The golden eyes were a turning point. They had burned away the last vestiges of Bill's doubt, replacing it with a cold, hard certainty. He was no longer just disturbed, he was being hunted. The predator of the Maine wilderness, Bill 7 Carter, was now undeniably the prey. The encounters, once fleeting and subtle, became bolder, more direct, though still frustratingly elusive. The game was escalating. He'd hear it now, the heavy, rasping breathing just outside his cabin windows, sometimes right against the glass, a wet, guttural sound that raised gooseflesh on his arms. He'd fling open a shutter, shotgun raised, only to find nothing but undisturbed snow and the chilling echo of that breath hanging in the frigid air. One morning, he found massive, unidentifiable claw marks gouged deep into the ancient pines, nearest his property line, so high on the trunks they could only have been made by something impossibly tall. The wood was splintered, raw, the scent of fresh pine sap mixing with that unsettling musky odor he now associated with the creature. They were deliberate, he knew, a chilling message carved into his territory. Then came the grotesque offerings. He began finding dismembered animals near his cabin, not deer, but local predators like coyotes and even a large bobcat. They were torn apart with brutal efficiency, left as if by design, a warning or a deliberate challenge. The sight turned his stomach, yet fueled a desperate, grim resolve. This wasn't just a beast. It was intelligent, malevolent, and it was playing with him. His remaining dogs, now 6, were in a perpetual state of agitation. Their usual sleep was fitful, filled with whimpers and low growls directed at unseen threats. Their unwavering loyalty to Bill was now mixed with a palpable terror. They pressed themselves against him whenever he was near, refusing to venture far from the cabin, even for their natural needs. Their once bright, keen eyes were haunted, their movements hesitant, their bodies tense. They were suffering, and Bill felt a fresh wave of helpless fury. The silence of the forest, once a comforting blanket, had been replaced by a subtle, omnipresent hum of malevolence. It was in the air he breathed, in the shadows that danced on, the edges of his vision, in the quiet creaks of his old cabin. Every sound was magnified, every shift of the wind a potential threat. He slept even less now, standing vigil by his window, shotgun in his lap, his gaze fixed on the tree line, waiting. He knew they were out there. They were everywhere. Then, one frigid morning, Bill woke to the horrifying realization that Buster, his oldest, most loyal, and most beloved hound, was missing. There were no tracks in the freshly fallen snow outside the woodshed where Buster usually slept. No bloodstains. Nothing but a faint, musky scent that made Bill's throat clench. His other dogs were whimpering, pressing against the cabin door, unwilling to step out. A cold, dreadful certainty settled in Bill's stomach, colder than the deepest winter. This wasn't just about fear anymore or an inexplicable phenomenon. This was personal. This was a violation, a calculated act of cruelty. The creature, or creatures, had crossed a line, had stolen a piece of his very soul. And in that moment, Bill felt a new, raw emotion stirring within him, a desperate, vengeful resolve that would drive him back into the heart of the darkness, no matter the cost. He would find Buster, or he would find what took him, and he would make it pay. Grief was a cold, sharp blade in Bill's gut, twisting with a thirst for vengeance. Buster was gone. Not merely lost or strayed, but taken. It was a calculated act, a declaration of war. The hunter, now the hunted, felt a primal rage ignite within him, burning away the last vestiges of fear and replacing it with a grim, unwavering resolve. He would no longer wait. He would confront. He spent the next day in a feverish preparation. He went to his hidden cache, a small lead-lined box buried deep beneath his workbench. From it, he retrieved a handful of silver bullets, meticulously handcast years ago, a desperate half-joking measure based on old folklore he'd always dismissed as superstition. Now they felt like his only hope, a tangible weapon against the impossible. He loaded his shotgun, the dull gleam of the silver against the dark steel a chilling sight. He reinforced his cabin again, boarding up every weak point, setting more intricate traps. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these efforts were largely futile against what was truly out there. but it was an act of defiance, a refusal to cower in the face of the encroaching darkness. He gathered emergency supplies, packed a small rucksack with a hunting knife, flares, and a compass. He was going back into the woods not to hunt, but to confront, to seek. The moon, he noticed with a grim irony, was approaching full again. Its light, already formidable, would soon reach its zenith, casting an ominous glow over the land. He knew it was a trap, a foolish quest, a suicide mission, but he couldn't stop himself. Buster's absence was a gaping wound in his soul, and the unanswered questions clawed at his mind. As dusk deepened, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges, Bill kissed the heads of his remaining hounds. They whined, sensing his grim determination, their anxious eyes fixed on him, but their loyalty held firm. They would not be left behind. He gathered them, spoke to them in low, reassuring tones, and then, shouldering his rifle, he led them out, into the biting cold, into the heart of the deepest, darkest woods he'd ever dared to tread. The air was thick with tension, palpable as a physical weight, thrumming with unseen energy. They moved slowly, cautiously, each crunch of snow underfoot, echoing unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The familiar paths blurred, the trees pressing in closer, forming a suffocating enclosure that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Deeper and deeper they went, past familiar landmarks that now seemed alien and menacing. The air grew colder, an unnatural chill that bit through his thick winter gear, and the musky, acrid scent intensified, leading them like a morbid beacon. Then they found it. A clearing, tucked away in a hollow, impossibly thick with ancient trees where the moonlight struggled to penetrate, casting only fractured shards of light onto the ground. What was truly unsettling was that there was almost no snow here, as if something had radiated an unnatural heat, melting it away. The ground was exposed, frozen earth, dark and raw. And there, etched into the frozen ground, was a symbol, a massive, crude claw mark, impossibly large, surrounded by other smaller symbols, almost like ancient writing, forming a strange, disturbing pattern. Bill didn't recognize it, but the sight of it instantly filled him with a primeval dread, a cold terror that resonated in the deepest parts of his being. It felt old, older than the trees, older than the snow, older than humanity. And then from the darkest part of the clearing, from deep beneath the exposed earth, he heard it, a low, resonant thrum. It was like a monstrous heartbeat, slow and powerful, echoing from the very earth itself, growing steadily louder, vibrating through the soles of his boots and up into his very bones. The hounds whimpered, pressing against Bill, their eyes wide and fixed on the darkness, their tails tucked. Bill raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger, his breath catching in his throat. He had found something terrible. And it was waiting. The low, resonant thrum grew louder, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath the clearing. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration that resonated with something ancient and terrifying within Bill. The air around him grew heavy, thick with the musky, sulfuric scent, and his remaining hounds were a trembling, whimpering mass, pressed against his legs, their eyes darting wildly into the impenetrable shadows. Bill took a step closer to the etched symbol, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The symbols were indeed ancient, crude yet powerful. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, as if he had stumbled upon a place that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. The claw mark wasn't just a symbol, it was part of a larger, intricate pattern that seemed to pulse faintly in the moon-drenched gloom. As he studied it, a horrifying realization began to dawn. The patterns, the energy he felt, the very nature of this place. It wasn't just a den, it was a sacred ground, an ancient ritual site, not for hunting, but for something far more primal. The thrum intensified, vibrating through the ground. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer began to rise from the center of the symbol, like heat haze off asphalt. Then from within the deepest shadows, Bill saw them. Not just silhouettes this time, but forms, vast and dark, shifting between the trees. They were impossibly tall, their matted fur blending seamlessly with the shadows, their golden eyes gleaming, like embers in the profound darkness. More than one, a whole pack, watching him, waiting. He didn't need to see Buster's remains to know. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Buster hadn't been killed and dragged off. He'd been taken, absorbed, perhaps even, horrifyingly, transformed. A single gnawed bone, partially buried near the largest symbol, confirmed it. A hound's femur, undeniably Buster's. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about survival. The creature he had shot that night hadn't been just a werewolf in the simplistic sense of folklore. It was something far older, far more integral to this land. A guardian, perhaps, or a manifestation of the wilderness itself. His bullet hadn't killed it. It had merely wounded it, sending it into a dormant state, a state of profound rest and regeneration, its essence dissolving back into the earth, rejoining the ancient energies of this hidden place. The chaotic animal tracks from 3 days ago weren't just scavengers. They were other creatures, drawn to the powerful, raw energy released by its temporary death, or perhaps even sent by this ancient pack to reclaim their fallen brother. The figures in the trees began to move, not attacking but circling, their movements fluid, almost ghost-like. They were silent, not even the crunch of snow underfoot. Their golden eyes were fixed on Bill, filled with an ancient, patient malevolence. They weren't rushing him because they didn't need to. He was already trapped. He had stumbled into their domain, violated their sanctuary, and awakened them. And now, he was marked. Bill raised his shotgun, his hand steady despite the cold terror gripping his heart. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his silver bullets would do little against beings that could simply melt into the earth and rise again. He wouldn't be able to kill them all. He wouldn't be able to kill any of them, not truly. This wasn't a hunt he could win with steel and lead. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a sentinel, forever linked to this darkness. He looked out at the silent, watching forms, their golden eyes burning in the gloom. He understood now. The fight wasn't over. It was a new, horrifying reality. He couldn't leave. This place, this ancient presence, would never let him go. He was part of it now, cursed or chosen. Years passed. Bill Seven Carter became a recluse, a gaunt, weathered specter in the heart of Maine. His once vibrant eyes were hollowed but impossibly sharp, always scanning the tree line, always listening. He never heard that monstrous howl again. The howls were now silent, replaced by the profound, unsettling silence of beings that no longer needed to make noise. He lived in a perpetual vigil, a quiet dread under the eternal Maine winter sky. His last remaining hound, an old, grizzled redbone named King, sat beside him on the porch, his eyes also fixed on the darkness, forever vigilant. Bill would sit there night after night, his shotgun across his lap, watching the silhouettes move at the forest's edge, where the moonlight couldn't quite reach. They were always there, observing, waiting. He had not defeated the threat. He had merely understood its nature, and that understanding was far more terrifying than any battle. He had become a part of their world, a living witness, forever looking over his shoulder, forever listening for the howls that never came, but for the silent watch from the forest's edge. He was not just guarding his home, he was guarding his sanity, living in an endless winter, forever awaiting their inevitable silent return.